Well, thank you so much, Keith Stein, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 94th guest. Happy New Year, Keith. You're my first guest of the new year.
Happy to be with you, Garrett.
Great to be with you as well. Would love to learn more about your career. I know that you're a lawyer for Denton's, businessman based in Toronto. You're also an investor and in youth sports, and would love to learn all about that. And my first question is always, what does relationship building mean to you, and what has it meant for your professional career?
Relationship building it's been foundational to everything I've done in my career. I started off, you mentioned I'm a lawyer, but way back when I was in law school, I knew that I didn't want to be a conventional lawyer. By that, I mean, I didn't want to practice law the way most lawyers practice law, and I really haven't. Yes, I'm at a great global law firm, but I'm not practicing on a day-to-day basis. I haven't really practiced law on a day-to-day basis in many decades. So I sort of followed the plan I had that I sort of hatched in law school. I think a law degree is a great foundation for business, and that was I was really more passionate with getting into business. So I thought about when I was young, I could go into business school or law school. I guess I just defaulted to law school. I also thought it would be interesting intellectually to be exposed to that type of education. But when I graduated from law school, I was again, I was my focus was on how do I make the transition now into business. And ultimately, I wanted to become an entrepreneur. I knew that, but I didn't have any money. So I had to develop my own nest egg and I had to hustle. So what I did was I did a few things pretty soon after law school. I was able to find my way into the automotive business. Toyota, this is back in the early 90s when you know how there's all this fascination with China, and China is the focus of geopolitics and so much that goes on. Well, back in the 90s, Japan was sort of the China. Japan was like really sexy and interesting. And I was intrigued by the possibility of going to work for a Japanese company. And because I was based in Southern Ontario, which was really a mecca for automotive manufacturing, I thought, boy, this could be a really strategic spot for me. So this does link back to the whole relationship issue. I was able to meet some people and I ended up networking with people at Toyota, and I became corporate counsel for Toyota. And I was young. I think I got that job when I was 29 years old. But that was just the start. I knew, okay, this is good. Now I've got a foot in a good door, but now the real work begins. I learned to speak Japanese. I was at a Japanese company. I thought, okay, Japan is hot right now. I'm surrounded by these Japanese executives from Japan who preferred to speak Japanese. And I just thought, okay, this is a good little way to maybe distinguish me from other people who are working at the company. So I learned to speak Japanese, and I took it one step further. I created a Japanese North American Friendship Foundation for young professionals. So it was a foundation, the mandate of the foundation was to promote more relationships between young business people in North America and Japan. Now, it didn't say this in the constating documents, in the corporate documents for this foundation, but there was another mandate for this foundation, and that was to allow Keith Stein to network, hustle, and meet people that he didn't know that he should know. And it did just that. I met many people, including at my first event, I had a former Canadian Prime Minister who I invited to speak at our inaugural event. I also invited some people who ran the largest independent car parts manufacturer in the world. This is a company with 150,000 employees. Every car in North America has about $3,000 to $5,000 worth of content produced by this company. Gigantic company, and there could be no better place for a young Keith Stein to work and so the transition from where I was at Toyota to get to this company, that was my dream job. And because I was still pretty young. So I invited these people from that company, which is called Magna International, and they got to see me in action, and I formed relationships with these people. And guess what? That was my next move. I went from being just a corporate lawyer at Toyota Canada to now I was hired to be the right-hand guy to the founder and chairman of this global company, MAG International, with all these different departments reporting to me. And I was doing transactions, doing all sorts of interesting things. Anyway, before we don't have to get more into this right now, if at all. But the point is, when I was 29 and 30 years old, and 31 years old, by the way, when you're young, that's what they don't teach you in school. And growing up, nobody taught me. You got to meet people and hustle and network. I wish I had been taught that, but I figured it out anyway. And I don't know, in this new world, I have no idea if relationships and building them are going to be as important as ever. I have a feeling, yes, regardless of what happens in technology, I still think the more people you know, the more dangerous you are. So I was able to use networking to really develop the first stage of my career. And absent that networking and that hunger to meet people, there's no way I would have gotten to Toyota in the first place. I wouldn't have got to Magna. And if I didn't get to Magna, I know at some point we're going to talk about John Kennedy Jr. If I didn't get to Magna and I sort of became a big shot there because I was a very senior executive with lots of power within this mega corporation, I had sort of the keys to the palace. So if the producers of Tommy Boy, do you remember that movie? The family owned, they were in the automotive business. So when they wanted to shoot a movie, of course, they called my company, Magna National, and who did they speak to? Me. Hey, Keith, can we use some of your factories? Hey, Keith, can we use your board? That's sort of a random example. But the point is, I now had this great platform for Keith Stein that led me to John Kennedy Jr., that led me to traveling around the world with Bill Clinton and meeting all sorts of great people, whether it was rock stars or politicians. And this wasn't just about fun. Hey, let's go, I want to meet a former president, or I want to hang out with the Rolling Stones or whatever. It was always with some type of purpose in mind, right? First, I enjoy meeting people from different walks of life. It's fascinating. It's enriching, but it can also be advantageous. So I met a lot of people along the way who helped me, and I helped them, because one of the key parts of developing relationships is don't just take, try to give more than you take. I was able to network effectively because I was able to add value, right? When Bill Clinton, the first charity golf event he did outside the United States post-presidency was at the Magna golf course. I facilitated all of that. So I was able to hand out all sorts of goodies and along the way, build my relationships with people who would, I think, really help me get to where I'm at today. And it's important not just to start relationships, but to keep watering them, growing them, because it's very easy for relationships to wilt if they don't get enough love and attention. So I've also maintained as many of my relationships as I was able to. Gene Simmons from KISS, so we're going to talk about all sorts of random people and things in this meeting. Gene Simmons is someone I actually engaged to help us at Magna with marketing 25 years ago. And Gene Simmons and I had worked on business deals ever since then. And we could talk about, because I've done some fascinating deals with Gene Simmons, including we had our own vodka company. But anyway, I am now hijacking your podcast, but you got me going. And you can see I'm a man of few words, and it's hard to get me to come out of my shell, but I will restrain myself now and turn things back over to you, Garrett.
No, all fascinating. And please, let's delve into these amazing stories. What's interesting is you mentioned President Clinton. Would love to learn more about your relationship with him. I just interviewed, I'll be airing my 92nd episode soon with Craig Manassian, who worked in the Clinton White House in the late 90s, worked for HBO, and he's the chief content marketing and communications officer for the Clinton Foundation and its Clinton Global Initiative. And I'm in Orlando, and although I've never personally met him, he's a fellow lawyer like you, John Morgan, very close to President Clinton. His Morgan law firm is based in Orlando, but it's the largest international injury law firm in the world. And there's that connection there. I'm in Orlando, and everyone knows who John Morgan is here, but he's internationally known for his specialty in the law. And you mentioned Gene Simmons. I know that he just recently was honored at the Kennedy Center, and would love to hear more about your relationship with Gene Simmons. And for my audience at home, who's younger than you and I, but Tommy Boy with Chris Farley and David Spade, I mean, that's one of the classic comedies in the 90s. So I love that you reference one of the top comedic movies from the 90s. But when you think of all these relationships, and then again, you mentioned JFK Jr., would love to hear about, that story and how you met just days before he passed. I interviewed Steve Gillen on my podcast, and he met JFK Jr. at Brown when JFK Jr. was a student there, and Steve was a professor there, and they became lifelong friends. And he became one of JFK Jr.'s close confidants. And he's an historian, as we know. And he had mentioned to me when I interviewed him that he had interviewed you for his book. And he said, you'll really enjoy your conversation with Keith. So I would love to, talk about these synergies, in your life with some of the guests I've had on, but also where you see yourself now. And you talk about your interest in investing in youth sports, and you're a businessman. And we've talked about that offline. And so I would love for you to maybe categorically talk about the things that matter to you from a relationship building standpoint, because for my audience at home who is inspired by the guests I have come on, because they see relationship building as the core to what they like to pursue in life, what their interests are, how do you get there through relationships, through networking, but it's more about that visceral effect of what I like to say is relationship building is the essence of humanity. And no matter what your niche is, or what your interests are, or what your professional and personal endeavors are, you always fall back on relationships, whether it's with your family, your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, people you just come across from every walks of life. So feel free to tell me what comes to mind. Which person or which story would you like to begin with?
Sure. But before I do that, because we'll run out of time, in terms of my business and career trajectory, because I mentioned I didn't want to just be a lawyer. I was interested in becoming a businessman. So I started off as an executive, but I wanted to become, even when I was the right hand guy to the founder of this global corporation, and I had a lot of flexibility. You know something? At the end of the day, I still had a boss. And if he called me on Saturday night at 11 p.m. and said, Keith, get your ass over here, I need to put out a fire, I had to do that. And I didn't mind doing that. But I thought to myself, I want to be putting out my own fires, ultimately, focusing on there's that Don Henley lyric about the lawyers work on small details. I wanted to be focusing on my own small details, not other people's. But I did transition. I stayed at that company. So I was about 30 years old, and I stayed there throughout my 30s, my early 40s. I did really well there, and I had that nest egg that I needed, and I was ready to, leave the nest and become an entrepreneur. So maybe we'll talk about it, maybe we won't, but I did many entrepreneurial things before I got to where I'm at today. And, some of the things I did included, so I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I'm in Florida right now, but I bought the donut company for the country, Krispy Kreme Donuts. So I was the owner of Krispy Kreme Donuts across Canada, which I loved owning because it was a very tangible thing. My kids, friends, they were charities. They would always call me and ask me for donuts. Other businesses I owned, I own other businesses that are more abstract to people, less relatable. So when I got an offer in 2019 from private equity that I could not say no to, I was a little bit sad that my connection to the donut business was ending. Although part of the in the transaction, I negotiated a term that I get free donuts, as many as I want for charities or whatever else for life. So that was an important part. But so there were many entrepreneurial adventures, but I'm 62 now, and I feel like I'm doing my most important business at this stage. And I'm doing it because I'm at a point where now what I want to do is I want to do things that have impact and where I can contribute. So only a few years ago, and this is also, it's a lesson to me. It shows me that it's never too late for an old dog to learn new tricks. I was never really involved in professional sports. I owned racehorses, but I was never really the guiding mind and the business driver behind any professional sport business. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I really got involved in the sport business. But just to, because I hate talking about the past too much, because the past is dead and doesn't really matter anymore. But we'll talk about it nonetheless. However, I do want to, I'm very proud of what I'm doing right now. And I'm trying to promote what I'm doing right now because you mentioned youth sport. It's not, well, youth are involved, but I'm involved in professional sport and I'm doing something in professional sport right now that is, without getting too grandiose, it is groundbreaking and it's really culturally and socially important. 14 months ago, we announced the launch of the only and the first women's professional baseball league in North America in over 80 years. And it sounds sort of insane that in the world we live in now, where professional women's basketball is gigantic and professional women's soccer and professional women's hockey all thriving and doing really well, it's amazing that when it comes to America's pastime, until I started this 14 months ago, there wasn't a league for all of the elite women baseball players in the United States and around the world. And I thought to myself, first as an entrepreneur, wow, what a fucking opportunity. Because just on the economic side, what's happening in women's sport, WNBA franchises are selling for $300, $400 million. You can't touch a professional women's soccer team for less than 100 mil. Certainly well over 100 million. It seems to be going great. Professional hockey, they're all booming. So I thought when the light bulb went off, I thought, wow, this is a tremendous business opportunity. And I saw it really through that lens. But as I developed the league, which has gone crazy. So when we launched it, the following week, we were on Saturday Night Live, and we've been on ABC Nightly News and CBS Morning Show and CNN repeatedly and ESPN. And there have been over 300 major news stories on the league in the last 12 months. So it's become a big thing. But when I launched it, I had not met hundreds of these women who play baseball or their moms and dads. And I've since met them. We had tryouts. We had tryouts in Washington, D.C. in August, this past August. And we had over 600 women from 10 different countries who came out to try out for this league. And they came out at their own expense. And in many cases, their parents came out and cheered them on. And I've never seen such passion. I've met many professional athletes, men and women, but women baseball players are the most special breed of athlete I've ever met. And I think it's for so many reasons. And I'll never be able to fully articulate it because I haven't lived it. But from what I've observed, these women baseball players have had to overcome so much adversity, so many challenges, being the only girl playing baseball when they were small on little league teams. And then in high school, being the only girl on a boys team because there weren't any girls teams. And this is a historical wrong that I think we have the ability to rectify now. What's the history on this? About 100 years ago, it was thought that women were not strong or athletic enough to play baseball. So they were all shifted into softball. The reality is that young girls, teenage women, adult women, they want to play baseball and they're great at it. They're phenomenal athletes. And I don't think everyone appreciates the number of women around the world who are participating in this game at the highest levels. In the US, there are 2.3 million women who play baseball each year recreation. In Japan, they've got 100,000 women registered for the Women's Baseball Federation. And by the way, the Japan women's game is more developed, I believe, than it is here in the United States. But the women's game is gigantic in Korea and Australia and Canada and so many countries around the world. And I'm so happy that we are creating this platform now that is launching next month. Now, the actual season begins next August in Illinois, but barnstorming and various marketing activities and promotions are going to begin in February and March. In March, we're doing something with a Major League Baseball team. We're going to have a joint training camp, and Major League Baseball and the commissioner being very supportive of this whole initiative. So very gratifying. But the point is, this is maybe the first business I've spearheaded where I can change lives. I believe this league is going to be a catalyst for a real renaissance in women's baseball for the youngest girls up to now the professionals who are playing in our league. And in fact, we're starting a farm system for women 16 and up. The farm system with our own minor league teams will start in 2027. And then beneath that, there's going to be a different pipeline for young girls ages 5 and up. So we're not just leaving things to chance. I always like to be the master of our destiny. to the extent possible. So we're creating this pipeline and very excited about how now you're going to see a tremendous women's baseball culture in the United States. And finally, women who are going to be able to play the same game that they grew up watching their brothers and fathers playing, or they played with their dads, and now they've got their own league. So I'm really excited about that. So, but let me take it back to what you wanted me to discuss. First, when it comes to, I haven't thought about Tommy Boy in decades, but maybe it's my proudest achievement. Because if you watch Tommy Boy, the very end, when all those credits are scrolling, at the very end, there's a special thanks to Keith Stein. So that might be my claim to fame in life.
I'll definitely look for that with respect to the credits. And before you continue about Tommy Boy, I don't know if you took a close look at the guests I've had on previously, but for my 60th episode, I interviewed Major League Baseball manager Joe Madden, who won the 2016 Chicago Cubs. And I would love to introduce you to him. He most likely would find what you're doing very interesting.
Joe's name has come up because we're talking to former major leaguers now, because it's a women's league. But you know what, the women is interesting. The women players have told me, I asked them, do you want to have female managers and female umpire? And they said, we want to have the best. We want to have people who are going to be, the best coaches are going to bring out the best in us. So they're agnostic about gender. Just get us the best. So I think we're probably going to be hiring a bunch of former major league managers and players to be part of the support system for our teams. So yes, please hook me up with Joe. But so back to relationship building. I mentioned Clinton, and there were other people that I met, but what I figured out way back when I was working at that automotive company, and I was a gatekeeper essentially. And gatekeepers, it's sometimes more valuable to know the gatekeepers than the people they work for, who they're gatekeeping for. So I figured out that it was more important for me to become friends with fellow gatekeepers, or people who had access to certain people or networks. So in the case of Clinton, it's very interesting how that relationship started, because it got off to a rocky start. So I arranged for Clinton to come to our Magna golf course. And this was going to be the launch of this very, very impressive, fancy golf club, one of the great golf clubs in Canada at the time. So I arranged one of our jets to go and pick up Clinton and everything and his staff. And Clinton showed up, and we had all the Canadian dignitaries there and other special guests.
And what year would this have been?
I'm thinking early 2000s.
So when he was still president, or would this have been?
Where did he finish?
So he was president from January 20th, 1993 through January 20th, 2001.
So yeah, it was later. It was 2002, right after the presidency. So he showed up, and we had a bunch of officials from our corporation. But guess who wasn't there? And there was media. But guess who wasn't there? My boss, Frank, who was the founder and controlling shareholder of the company. And I thought, boy, this is curious, because in the days leading up to the event, Frank was calling me because we had Secret Service and the dogs all over the campus, because there was the golf course and our headquarters and other grounds. So Frank would call me and say, hey, Keith, how's it going with Clinton? He seemed very interested. But the day of the event, Frank wasn't around. So Clinton arrived, and I was hoping to make an introduction and we'd have a good photo op. And I called Frank. I said, Frank, the president's here. Are you coming over? And he said, no, have him come to my house. And I said, Frank, we've got lots of guests here and everything. It's a jam-packed day. We've got the president playing golf with people and signing things. And then we have this special dinner. He'll come to the dinner, but how do I get him to come to your house? Frank said, get him to my house, and he hung up the phone. So I was really good at my job because I always got shit done. I'm good at executing and making things happen. So Clinton was there with his gatekeeper, a guy named Doug Band, who was his chief of staff post-presidency. And I had just a cordial professional relationship with Doug. We hadn't really, that was our first time meeting. And one of the first things I had to do in this new relationship was go and ask this guy if he could get his boss to come to my boss's home. So I went up to Doug and I said, Doug, I need a favor here. I don't know if you'll be able to help me out. No, we can't. Can you get the president we're only talking about like a 2-minute drive over to my boss's home. Can we get the president to come over there?" And Doug looked at me like I was insane, and he said, "No fucking chance." And I took it in, and I spent the next couple of hours making sure that Doug was treated like the greatest rock star on the planet, and that his boss, the president, was treated like the greatest rock star on the planet. And I wanted to show him how we treat people. So I was trying to kiss ass to get him to soften up. Anyway, to come to the point, by the end of the day, I had Clinton at my boss's house. Okay, so it made that happen. And Doug and I, we started off our relationship in that weird, awkward way, but we became very close friends. And you know what? I got to go in motorcades with the president, or got to travel on planes with him, and went to Europe with him, and went to all sorts of places with him. I've been to his home because of Doug Band. It's not that his boss liked me so much. We got along. It was fine. We had fun together and good times. But I developed that core friendship with Doug Band. And in my case, when I develop these relationships, it's not about being fake or just being mercenary. Yes, I know that I recognize when there's going to be benefits, but if you're not authentic, if you're not really befriending someone because you truly want to be his friend, it's not going to work out. So if there's someone you need to build a relationship with, and you feel there's going to be real chemistry, you can be friends, and that person is going to be strategic for you, then it ticks off all the boxes that you should be going for it. But gatekeepers have been how I really have developed so many important relationships. And again, working with gigantic corporations, look for, sometimes it's hard getting in touch with the CEO or the chairperson. So I look for the people around, somebody, maybe somebody on the board. Anyway, there are many ways to develop relationships and network. One of the things I always try to do is look at the people around the people you needed to meet. And if you could forge those relationships, you'd probably end up developing the right relationships with the people on top. I know you want me to talk about John Kennedy Jr., so let me speak to that. Is that okay, Garrett?
That is totally fine. And to your point about gatekeepers, throughout my career, I always found that whether it's the gatekeeper or the principal himself or herself, the CEO or chairman, if you will, that you want to find commonalities, you want to find synergies. I love how you talk about authenticity. If they believe that you're authentic and that you are someone who actually cares about who they are and what position he or she is in, and they could just see that there's purpose behind your messaging and that there is a seriousness to why you're reaching out to them, whether it's a cold call or, you just happen to meet this person in a very interesting way, just like you discussed with meeting with President Clinton's chief of staff and how you had to arrange the meeting with your boss, Frank, and President Clinton. But if the person that you develop a relationship with, if there's a pivotal moment in the early conversation, or there's something so memorable or something that's unique that you never thought or predicted would happen, and it did, but it naturally, it organically manifested. I believe that that's when two people can look back on that situation and, come away maybe with the same or a different interpretation of how that all unfolded. But that's where relationships start. They start sometimes in the most unlikely scenarios. And that's what makes it truly special when you look back on it, 10, 20, 30 years. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
I agree, but there's something else I want to underline. Most people have lots of friends and relationships. So especially people who are in important roles, they can be a little cynical about people's motives. Why does someone want to, become my friend? But when I've established my relationships, and whether it's with people in these great positions of power or people who are not in positions of power, I have the same modus operandi. People who are in my orbit can count on complete and utter loyalty. And most people say that, but the people who know me And that's why I can call them up and ask almost anything of them, because they know the reverse is true and I've demonstrated it. But if you're really going to get far in your relationship building, in addition to everything else we've talked about, authenticity and talking to the right people and treating them the right way, but loyalty, which isn't talked about enough, but real loyalty underpinning a relationship, that's going to solidify friendships forever. Anyway, so when I was at this large global car company, working with the founder, I also became close with his family members. And they had an appetite. It was interesting. They were sort of bored by the car business, even though it made them billionaires and the company was producing tens of billions of dollars. They were interested always in other things. For example, Frank, my boss, was interested in horse racing. So I was involved and assisted when he wanted to buy all the big racetracks in the United States, Santa Anita, Gulfstream, etc. But this appetite of theirs was very broad, and I think it was driven by just a curiosity about doing new interesting things and meeting new interesting people. So I had the same appetite, and I could really satisfy what they were looking for and what I was looking for at the same time by always being on the lookout for interesting business opportunities and relationship opportunities. So I had a friend who was an editor at Vanity Fair magazine named Leslie Marshall. And Leslie was friends with John Kennedy Jr. Leslie, who lived in New York, told me that John was looking for money for his publication, George. You probably know this from your interview with Steve, know all about this. So I said, yeah, I would. So of course, I was very interested. Guys, I actually liked George. I thought it was an interesting publication. It would be great to have it today. It could play an interesting role in the media. So Leslie connected me with John, and John agreed to fly into Toronto for a meeting. And I remember he was landing at our hangar. So I drove my car up on the tarmac after he landed, and he just landed. He was getting out of this plane. And I've got to tell you, it didn't look very Kennedy-esque. We all have images of the Kennedys. It looked like, and it was a little puddle jumper. That's how I viewed it. And not only was it a dinky little aircraft, not know anything about aviation, so maybe just that was my take on it, but it certainly wasn't a jet. But he came out of it with two crutches and his foot in a sling, and his co-pilot was like a kid. He might have been more than 18 or 19 years old. He looked like he was 18 or 19, but he certainly didn't look to be more than in his early 20s. So I thought, oh boy, this is, pretty laid back approach to travel by the Kennedys. So John hopped in my car, literally hopped in my car because he was on crutches, and we had some time to kill. So we drove around for about 45 minutes. Our meeting where we were going to meet was up at our campus, which was about 45 minutes away. So we were talking about everything, and I was immediately impressed by how down to earth he seemed and very easy to talk to. He had a curiosity. He would stick his head out the window and say, "What's that?" And he was asking me questions about Canada. So yeah, it was just a nice, easy first part of our meeting, and then we got down to business. We had a meeting. We talked about his magazine, and I asked him, "Why are you here in Canada talking to me about getting funding for your publication? You're Kennedy. There should be a lineup of people who want to support you." And he said, "I'm here because I just like to do things off the radar." I didn't think he wanted to, which was an interesting choice of words, given what would happen in the days following. But I think he really wanted to not shine a spotlight on his fundraising, and he wanted to get a partner who was going to be a little bit maybe less conspicuous. So I thought he thought dealing with Canadians, it would be more discreet. But we talked about everything. Talked about how he wanted to have kids and life a little bit. I remember I think he was 2 or 3 years older than me, so we're still pretty young. He might have been 40, and I asked him, do you think about aging at all? Not that he was old, but just curious of what he thought about generally. And I was picking his brain. And he said, "Nah, I don't think about what I can't control." And that I know that's sort of an obvious thing about life, but the obvious things don't always occur to me. And it's something I think about a lot, not only to honor his memory, to think about him, but in my own day-to-day life, I think about like, don't get stressed out about things I can't control because there's so many things I can't. So the next day, oh, before he left, actually, so I drove him back to the hangar. And what's interesting is that at our meeting, so Leslie Marshall from New York was there, and John said, "Hey, Leslie, why don't you fly back with me?" And I don't know why, but I was very protective of Leslie. And I said, "Leslie, I flew you in for this meeting. I'm flying you back out." I just didn't want her flying back on that plane. And even back at his hangar, at our hangar, when he was going to take off, he said, "Keith, you want to go for a quick spin?" And I declined. Just wasn't comfortable with that plane. And then, of course, we know what happened in the days following. And on that terrible day, Leslie Marshall called me. She was very emotional and thanking me for not letting her go on that plane, even though he did get back safely that night. But to have been on that plane, I think would have been given what took place. I understand why she was pleased she never set foot on it. So John sent me a fax. We used that, of course, back then, and thanking me for the meeting and wanting to have more talks. And we talked about a mutual connection. I think I'd met one of his relatives in the States. I'd been invited to something in the state by one of his relatives, and he mentioned that. Just all mundane stuff, and that was it. Then 2 days after that, or 3 days after that, like everybody else in the world, I heard what happened.
When you heard what happened and your friend Leslie from Vanity Fair, the editor from Vanity Fair, she was emotional. What were your first thoughts? I mean, did you get emotional? And, what was that processing like, in the days, weeks, months, years since? And when you look back on that meeting, was there promise there where, not knowing what was going to happen a few days later, but were you thinking, I would love to consider investing in George? Or did you feel that after you met with him that, it was a great meeting, but I don't know if it's going to be a fit for me? Knowing how things unfolded, we'll never know how your relationship or new relationship would have formed with him, given the mutual connection with Leslie and having met one of his relatives in the States. But what had came to mind at that moment? And when you reflect on that, because you just interestingly said that it's unfortunate we don't have a magazine like George that exists today, in the media landscape, representing them in the media landscape. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
I was in absolute shock. It was just shock. What I remember feeling is shock, disbelief. It didn't seem real to me, and I think I think everybody felt sadness because we all have a real connection to that family. Even me as a Canadian, they were very much part of my life and everyone's life, and everyone remembers certain images. So I was sad, and when these tragedies happen, it's just a reminder of how fragile life is, and we're all just passing through. So I do think about how we've got to really try to do some things while we're here. But with respect to the investment opportunity, I am pretty sure that I can't say for certain that it would have culminated in an actual deal or investment, but I'm very sure that I would have done everything possible to try to get it to the deal stage and make it happen. And I say that because that's why I was so amazed. He was with me in Toronto and he was talking to Canadians because the strategic upside to being aligned with this guy, even if weren't a fan of the publication, the relationship opportunity and upside was so great. And I don't think the investment, I don't remember how much capital he was seeking, but I don't think the capital he was seeking would have been so great that it would have slowed me down in trying to develop a business relationship that could be a much bigger life-changing, that could offer all sorts of life-changing dividends. When you have a relationship with someone like him, it's an extraordinary thing. So who knows what would have happened, but I think I would have given it a really good shot. And I have a feeling that something could have happened. We would have been good partners, and we would have been loyal and all those good things. And it would have been can you imagine if he were still alive today? What would he be doing today? It's
Right.
that's that's really interesting. Who would John Kennedy Jr. be today? Because he was so many things already in the short life that he lived. He was a lawyer and a law student and a sex symbol and a magazine publisher. And he gave some great speeches too, including the one at the Democratic Convention. I think his evolution was ongoing. I think he was, some people don't grow as much as they move through life. I think he would have kept evolving, and he would have been one of the great people of this country.
Yes, and it's interesting because of your relationship with President Clinton, because and this is what I read, it's public information that at the time when there was a search going after his plane went down, President Clinton was in office and he mobilized a lot of our, military assets, and with the unlimited reach to try to find that plane and do everything possible as our commander in chief at the time to find him alive and find his wife and sister alive. So, did you ever mention to President Clinton about your interaction with JFK
Yeah.
Jr.?
Yeah, and the conversation, it was at his home actually, and my recollection is that the conversation went in an interesting direction. Clinton's a great man, has so much compassion for others, and he treats everyone with so much dignity. That day at the golf club, I remember he wouldn't leave to go to Frank's house, my boss's house, until he went into the kitchen and signed autographs for everyone working in the kitchen. Cared about all people, and he saw everyone. But when we talked about John, he talked about how much he had tried to do at that time and how big a supporter he was of the Kennedys generally. And the unusual direction the conversation went in is that, and I think Clinton's big on loyalty. He was just such a loyal guy, and of course he would expect loyalty from people. And I think he felt that Ted Kennedy, in the end, had not been supportive of Hillary, and Clinton expressed that he had felt let down and disappointed, and that's really that became the focus of the conversation. He had a lot of very strong emotions about Ted Kennedy and how he was so disappointed by him after everything he had done, not only for John, but he had tried all through his career to support the Kennedys. And I think
Wow.
he's a fan of boy, what a fan of popular culture he is. So anyone who's a fan of popular culture and is dialed in the way he is, and when he grew up with Camelot. Like he met Kennedy Sr. as a young man. There's a picture, a famous picture. So they were very much steeped in his upbringing. Clinton loves certain people. He loves Elvis Presley. Right? Elvis Presley is one of the great heroes in his life, and I think the Kennedys were heroes. So he loved the Kennedys, but he certainly didn't love whatever happened between him and Ted. Anyways, that's my experience with the Kennedys and John, and it's obviously something I can never forget.
You talk about the picture of, Bill Clinton at the time when he was a young man meeting President Kennedy in that famous picture online, and how I came across your name when I was preparing for my interview with Steve is that there's a picture of you online with JFK Jr. with his crutches. And if I could be a fly on the wall, in that meeting with you both, just because, I'm very much I love history. And, you know, for what it's worth, you are a part of political history in that small but profound way, because you were one of the last people to see him alive. When you think about
I'd be told I was the last person to have a business meeting with him, maybe, but I'm a very small footnote, if that. But what I will say is, John and I connected, and it's weird because didn't spend that much time together. But when two guys around the same age, and you spend almost 2 hours in a car, like an hour, 2 hour meeting, an hour back, and then during the meeting, you're talking. If you have some sort of connection, you're going to talk about stuff. So there are certain things he shared with me, like nothing earth shattering, but just things that were revealing about his personality and what he thought about that I haven't shared with anyone, and I won't, because I think that would be a violation. But I do want to tell you something. Just I'm remembering funny anecdote because we're talking about Clinton, who's such a fascinating guy, right? There's so many dimensions to Clinton, and I've seen him in so many different settings and in different contexts. I remember once we were on our plane. There were 4 or 5 of us on this plane, and there were 4 seats at the front of the plane, and Clinton was in one seat, John Bon Jovi was in the seat across from him, I'm in the seat next to Clinton. So we're talking about all sorts of things, and because it was such a free-flowing conversation, I thought it was cool for me to ask what I did. So I said, "Mr. President, and John, if you don't mind, I've got a question to ask you, because sometimes I'm fortunate enough to hang out with rock stars, and sometimes I'm fortunate enough to hang out with presidents, but I don't often hang out with both of them at the same time. So here's my question. What's the better gig?" And I asked that question because I was curious about the answer, but also asked the question because I knew Clinton told me he wanted to be a musician at one time, but he said it wasn't good enough. So I had a feeling Clinton would have liked to have been a rock star. And at that time, in the early 2000s, I think Clinton was the biggest rock star on the planet. So here's how they responded. And it was really John who did most of the responding. Clinton didn't say much. And John Bon Jovi said, "I think rock star because you get to keep the house." And about a week or two after that meeting, we were all flying out to a horse race together. So we went to see the Preakness race, and then we all flew back together. And John's wife was on that plane too. But a week or two later, Clinton's chief of staff, my good friend Doug, sent me a picture of all of us, because there had been a picture of all of us taken outside the plane. Clinton, Bon Jovi, me, a few other people, Doug. And Clinton had inscribed on the photograph, "Keith, what's better, being a rock star or having a black belt in karate?" Like, I can't remember John's wife's name, Bethia or something, Dorothea. And it was just funny that he remembered the question, and even though he changed it, he said, "I got this photograph where he did that description." That's one thing I do have framed that I really like.
That's awesome. And I love how you brought up John Bon Jovi, because my guest, Michael Lombardi, who's a 3-time Super Bowl champion, won Super Bowls with the Niners and the Patriots. He's a guy from New Jersey, like me. I was born in New Jersey, and there's a picture of him, John Bon Jovi, reading Michael Lombardi's book on his X account that he likes to show on his social media. I always like to find, when you mention a name or when my guests mention names, I try to think back to what other previous guests have talked to me about. And if they mention names, I like to put pieces together, because it really is interesting how it is a very small world. And I do believe in the expression that we're all 6 degrees of separation from each other, because you can talk about either a lifelong friend or colleague or someone you just had briefly met or spent time with a few times. But that's what I love about relationship building, because where a person like John Bon Jovi impacted your life in one way, he could also impact another one of my guests, Michael Lombardi, in another, right? By reading his book, and that's like one of his heroes. So I love the conversation we're having. And again, with respect to JFK Jr., the fact that I used expression "off the radar," I know Steve had mentioned that to me when I was interviewing him, and
Steve said that, John has said that to me, or it was a John phrase that he commonly used?
I think what I had interviewed Steve, and he was talking about the conversation he had with you about his book. I believe he had mentioned to me in my interview that John had said that to you, the comment "off the radar." And then Steve and I thought that was pretty interesting.
But I want to go back to something you just said about degrees of separation. This is what's so wonderful and interesting about building relationships. Those degrees of separation shrink the more people you know. So you'll find once you're in certain loops, you just keep meeting the same people or other interesting people in the world. Everyone knows everyone else. Now, look, there are all sorts of different bubbles, so it depends what bubble you're in. But I met Bon Jovi that first time, and incidentally, I wanted to, he's one of the great rock stars. And I'm not saying that because of his music, which is good. I'm saying it because of his character. I like people who treat everyone with decency, and he's one of those. Could I, I've seen him in action. I've seen the way he interacts. He doesn't act like a rock star. But I was at Hillary's 60th birthday. It was a pretty small event inside a church. And I sat at Hillary's table with my wife, and John Bon Jovi and his wife were at the table. And it was night. There may be 60 or 70 people there that night. But Edge from U2 was at another table. And the table next to me, Robbie Robertson, a great Canadian and Torontonian. Robbie Robertson was the I don't want to say the key architect of the band, but he was a driving force of the band, the rock group, the band. The way in so many great songs, Cripple Creek, and one of the most important rock bands in music history, really. So they started off as the band for Bob Dylan, and then they left Dylan and became this really important group. But it was cool for me. I didn't talk to Robbie that night, but so Robbie's at the other table, and I had lunch with him in LA maybe 6 months prior to that. We didn't become friends or anything. And he was, unlike John, who's a people person, Robbie, at least with me, was a little more aloof. But this cool party, so I'm glad I'm reminded of it now. At a certain point, President Clinton, I think, went up on stage and said, I wanted to introduce someone, special guest. And Eric Clapton came on. And Eric Clapton, we're in this church, and Eric Clapton, what was his first song that he sang? He only just did a few songs, but the first song was Cocaine. Okay, and
in the church.
All right. And Clinton was like, he was taken aback by it. Like he's not, he's a very cool guy. So I don't, he just rolls with things. But I think he just thought it was funny. But I loved looking over at Robbie Robertson, who was also a guitar great. Robbie Robertson died, I think about 2 years ago, but not too long ago. But just watching him watch this other icon, another great guitarist on stage, and it was just a wonderful moment. Anyway, so you can see how we can play this game of degree of separation. One thing leads me to another. But once you become part of a community of people, it's very easy to not only have interesting experience, but meet them and meet lots of other interesting people.
Absolutely. And I really have enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to many more conversations offline with you. I would love to have another conversation with you about, what you're doing with these professional sports leagues with women. And I was thinking of the movie A League of Their Own with Tom Hanks and Gina Davis, women's professional baseball during World War II, how professional baseball for women, if you will, put it on the map, and that the Hollywood movie highlighted that. And the fact that you were trying to bring that back.
Oh, we're bringing it back with a vengeance, I think, but with love and positivity. But we're talking to Gina right now. I think Gina will maybe she'll throw out a first pitch or do something like that, because yes, when people always bring up that movie, it's a great movie. And I think when I think of that movie, I think most people think of Gina. So yes, we are giving the players a league of their own. And we'll start all sorts of barnstorming programming in the months ahead. So lots of exciting things. Our partner in the league is Fremantle Media, which produces America's Got Talent, American Idol, Family Feud, all these great shows. So they're going to be doing the broadcast deal for us, and they're already producing a docuseries. So you've seen, or you're probably familiar with, the Netflix Drive to Survive shows and shows like that. Hopefully you'll be seeing one in our league in the near future. But Garrett, it's been fun. Thank you for taking me back for this stroll down memory lane. I don't like visiting it very often because that could be idiosyncrasy of mine. I like focusing more on what I'm doing and what's ahead. But there are some good reminders from the past.
Absolutely. And, let me know if you get in contact with Tom Hanks. One of my other guests, Joe Seldner, a man like you who's done so much exciting different things, and they all overlap one way or the other. But he was Tom Hanks' creative executive in the 80s for a few years before Tom Hanks' career took off, but they worked together in Hollywood. And so when I think of A League of Their Own, I think of Tom Hanks and Gina Davis. But best of luck with everything. Look forward to staying in touch. I want to thank you again for being my 94th guest on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. Look forward to having many more conversations in the future with you, and really enjoyed our time, Keith, and congratulations on all of your success and all of what you've accomplished and all the people's lives you've touched and impacted and all the great work that you do in Canada, the United States, and around the world.
Garrett, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Look forward to talking with you again. All the best.
Thank you so much, Keith. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye bye.